I sometimes see people say that all headphone amps, all amps in general sound the same if they measure the same. And so I've got a really interesting video today to kind of explore that a little bit. And specifically to look at that, I've got here the Red Roo SE5. I reviewed this a while ago. It's a tube, speaker amp, and headphone amp. It's a transformer coupled design, and the reason I've got two of them on my desk is that I reviewed this one a little while ago. This is the regular standard version of the SE5, and then Phil from Red Roo has sent me out an identical version. I say identical in the sense that all of the general circuitry and layout is the same, but the key difference is it's got upgraded output transformers and upgraded output capacitors. And I thought this was great for three reasons. Firstly, it gives us an opportunity to talk about what differences do the components in these amplifiers make. Secondly, it's a chance for you to understand what you could expect if an amplifier, maybe you're DIYing, or maybe you've got an opportunity to buy a pre-made amplifier at different specification levels. What sort of differences can you expect if you have an amplifier that you have upgraded or can buy upgraded with better quality parts? And then finally, if you're specifically interested in a DIY kit-based tube amp like the Red Roo SE5, you can find out which version you should spend your money on. So we've got a little bit to cover here. I think it's going to be really interesting. Let's dive straight in. The Red Roo SE5 comes in at 1,289 Australian dollars. So that's not US, that's Australian dollars, making it somewhere in the vicinity of about 800 to 900 US dollars. And that's for the kit, the DIY kit with the tubes. You can also buy it without the tubes for a bit less money, and you can also buy it as a solderless kit, meaning that you don't have to do any of the actual connection of the parts to the circuit boards. You can just buy it almost like a flat pack. And I talked about that more in my original SE5 review. I'll put a link for that one down below if you want to go more into detail about the kit, putting it together, all that sort of stuff. But what you need to know is, if we're talking US dollars, it's about an $800 to $900 kit. Or if you want to spend an extra, probably around about 200 US dollars, I think it's 379 extra in Australian dollars, that's going to get you the Audiophile version with the upgraded output capacitors and the upgraded transformers. Whichever version you buy, it's going to output about 5 watts RMS into an 8 ohm load. So it's not a hugely powerful speaker amp, but for sensitive speakers or a small near field type setup like mine, it's got plenty of power. I've driven the Harbath P3 ESR XDs on my desk here, which are not a particularly sensitive speaker. This drives them really nicely at about 50 to 60% volume. The SE5 runs a pair of EL34 tubes in the power sockets and 12 AT7 tubes in the input sockets or the gain stage. And you can have those wired up as a pentode mode, a triode mode, or an ultralinear mode. Now the ultralinear mode is not available if you're buying the upgraded Audiophile version. Those particular transformers don't offer it. And so I've tested both of these in single-ended triode mode, which is probably my preference in terms of general sound quality. Again, regardless of which version you run, it's a pure Class A tube amp. And then on top of that, it's also got a Bluetooth module if you want to stream Bluetooth and not have to connect this up to a DAC. So it's really versatile, nice and compact, pretty powerful for what you're paying and the size of it. And as I talked about in my original review of the SE5, the general sound quality is excellent for the money, I think. It's not class leading or kind of giant killing, but it's definitely very good. I'm not going to delve into general sound quality here because that's all covered in the original review. And so instead, let's jump straight in to talking about the differences between the stock and the Audiophile versions, remembering again that everything is set up identically between the two. So I've used the exact same tubes. I've only got one set of tubes for these. So exact same tubes, exact same settings. This gives you the choice to have feedback on or off, things like that. Everything was identical. And my specific testing setup was running out of a PC, running a high quality JCAT USB card. So it's equivalent to a good quality streamer output. I connected that via the Tubulus Consensus USB cable out to the Sengran DS DAC 1.0, which I'll be reviewing very soon. It's a really interesting DAC. And then from the DS DAC, out to the two different amplifiers running curious RCA cables. One of the tracks that I listened to, but I did listen to multiple tracks, one of the tracks though that I made notes on was King for a Day by Jamiroquai. And one of the reasons I liked this track and paused on this one or stayed on this one to make some notes is it starts off with some nice articulated simple sounds, synthesizer and then piano. And then it gets busier and a bit more powerful as the track goes on. And so it gave me some nice insights into the difference between the stock version here and the Audiophile version here. Now, by the way, I'm not picking them up and showing you all the details and the ins and the outs of them because there's not a lot to see. They're both exactly identical from the outside. On the inside these black covers is the difference of the transformers. You can't see those under the covers. And then there will be a couple of different capacitors in there based on the stock versus the audiophile version, having two improved output capacitors that are generally going to be munned off based on my conversations with Phil from Red Roo. And going between these two amplifiers, listening to King for a day, the most obvious thing I noticed, the first and foremost thing that I noticed, was that things like articulation and transients were cleaner and crisper from the audiophile version. And it wasn't subtle, it was a significant improvement. What that translated to was that piano in the beginning of King for a Day had more sense of attack. You could hear more of the percussiveness or even feel more of the percussiveness, which is not to say it got forceful or harsh or in your face. It was just cleaner and better defined. That also helps with things like image separation and image focus, so the image and the soundstage became more defined from the audiophile version. And because of that extra separation, the depth in the soundstage also became more evident. I don't know that necessarily I'd say the soundstage got bigger, but the differences or the space between the sounds all got more resolved, and that helped to lay out the soundstage more clearly. So total size probably stays about the same, but definition and placement of instruments becomes clearer and therefore helps you to understand the soundstage better. The final key difference that I noticed was that the resolution, the sense of texture and detail retrieval, that was also a step up. And so the long and the short of it is that improving key components within an amplifier absolutely makes a big difference. The ability for those components, whether it's the output transformers, the capacitors, in some cases I've had resistors make this difference as well in my own DIY projects, those little tiny bits and pieces that are in the signal path in particular, but this is true for power supply stage as well to a lesser degree, any of those components, particularly the ones in the signal path, are going to make a difference as to how cleanly and transparently they convey the signal. And in the case of the upgrade from the regular to the audiophile version SE5, I think it's a definite worthy upgrade. Unless you specifically want the ultra linear mode, which I think from memory does give you just a little bit more power output compared to the single-ended triode mode, unless you actually want that specifically, I don't really see any reason to not get the audiophile version. For $379 Australian dollars, I think it's definitely a worthwhile upgrade to add it to the SE5 because it's definitely taking the amp to a next tier level. And indeed, with the audiophile version of the SE5, now all of a sudden it's starting to compete with much more expensive amplifiers like the Elekit TU-8200R. Now the 8200R still has more power, it still gives you more versatility with tube rolling, but if you'd rather save some money, if you're not wanting to go down the rabbit hole of rolling tubes, and if you want a more compact sized amplifier, that's where the SE5 can be a real winner. So I'm going to keep this one really short. I just want to say a huge thanks again to Phil for letting me have a play around with this amplifier. I think it's a fantastic design. I love the fact that you can buy it as a solderless kit for those that don't feel comfortable soldering, and yet still get the pleasure and the benefits of DIY. So if that sounds good to you, check out the links down below through to Red Roo. By the way, there's no affiliations here. This is just a product that I think is kind of cool. And so if you want to check it out, the links are down below to go through and take a look at the Red Roo website. Remember, there's also the link for the full review if you want to know more about the SE5, what it's capable of, etc. As a reminder, the only difference that the audiophile upgrades make is in sound quality and the removal of the ultra-linear mode. And so everything else in that review is completely accurate and completely true for both versions of this amplifier. So check those out. I hope this has been useful. If you have found the video useful and helpful, as always, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave to the music. So happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.